Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We reached the end of the top paragraph on page 1301. Aleph Shin Aleph. And what did we learn? Rabbi Rashab continued the theme we've been discussing and learning about the avodah of an eved, that though in the level of giluyim, of pure revelation and firepower, so to speak, in a revealed way, a minister is higher than a servant in the hierarchy of things. Yet the eved has something that can access deeper levels, and his root is a higher level. That's why he can draw down healing and change this world. Story with Rabbi Hanina ben Deisa and Rabbi Yechon ben Zakkai that he began at the top of page 1300. And briefly, the eved is bittul be'etzem mahuseh. His whole being is completely subjugated, completely sublimated, and dedicated to his master, in this case to God. Moshe Avdi, David Avdi. Moshe is Ma of Ma. David is Shem Ban, which is even more because it's from the Lamata Lamaila, like he explained. And what is the work of an eved? He does the actual labor. Say in a home or in a palace, he would be the one that serves the king, brings everything. What is it in Avedis Hashem? Avedis HaBirurim, of working with this material world, Mamata Lamaila, from the bottom up, making the world a Keli Talakus, as he said. And when that will be completed, as he said, not just the birur of the world, but also the birur of the eved, because he's doing it in a manifest way. So he's also called the mizbarer. The divine soul is manifesting in the animal soul. When that's complete, that elevates l'mayla makol madregas all the way to Keser and the highest levels of Keser, as it says, Hine Yaskalavdi Yorim v'Nisa v'Gova Me'ed, Aliyas HaMalchus to Keser, and he explains the details in Zohar. That's the moon. Malchus elevating, and Yaskil Commander Orech Recha, like one who filled up with an aroma. The Reach, the Amshacha from Moiches Tema. Yorim is the Sitra of the light, the energy, the light that's higher than all lights. That's Keser of Keser, within Keser. V'Nisa is Avram Chesed of Atik. V'Gova is Yitzchak Gvura of Atik. And Ma'id is Yaakov Teferes Avatik. So Chesed and Gvura is more the Gulgalta Meiches Tema, the skull of Meiches Tema. And Teferes goes even higher than Arich, that he called it the cream of the Avira, the membrane of this, above the space, above the brain, above the mind. Chev Atzmus, the level of Radla, and La'osid Malchus will elevate all the way to that level, the Eved, all the way to that place. And that's why the Zohar concludes, and because of that, it will cause Tchias HaMesim, that the very mess, that the body, that the soul is separate from, it itself will rise from the ground, and the Guf Yeh Lakus Mamish, the words he uses on top of page 1301. So this is Malchus that came down to be Mavar Birurim, Mamata Lamaila, came down to separate, refine, and separate and clarify and separate and refine this world from the bottom up. And the same thing with the Neshamas of Ban. Their primary work is with the Chomer, with the substance, with matter. And that's the general, the Avedis HaEved, the Bittul Be'etzem Mahus, and Malchus elevating to Atzmus Ein Sof. That's what we learned yesterday, and we concluded top of page 1301. Does anyone have any questions on this? So now he continues. So we're continuing the new paragraph on 1301, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So he says like this, V'agam shenizbar le'il. He's now going to make a qualification. You're explaining to me the level of Birurim. If you remember, we had a long discussion close to the end of volume 2, that there's Birurim and there's that which is higher than Birurim. Shabbos is a higher level of Birurim, or altogether higher than Birurim. Birurim is a descent in a world where you need clarification and separation. What's birur? Birur means that, let's say, food, the nutrients are mixed together with the dross, with the waste. You need to separate pselis mina echel or echel mina pselis, the food from the waste and the waste from the food. That's the avodah yemei achel we learned in the weekdays. Shabbos is birur echel miteich echel, one level, or altogether higher than birurim, like the level of man. Lechem and hashamayim did not need digestion because there was no waste; it had no pselis. So he's now going to use that to ask to qualify or ask a question and qualify what we just learned. And though we learned earlier when we spoke about the man, the bread from heaven, what did we learn? The quality of this bread over bread from earth, that is higher than birurim, because it comes from the top down and it doesn't have waste in it. It's not like bread of earth that comes from the earth and therefore has waste, and then we have to separate the two. Through birurim, we draw down an oyer that more manifests and relates to existence. Commotion is barisham, as was explained there earlier. And this we're talking again in volume 2. You want the exact pages? I can tell you. This began this discussion back in volume 2. Let me just look exactly where it was. We started Rosh Hashanah, Shabbos, and the weekdays. Let's see. Going back now. Wow. Let me just look it up where he began Birurim. Actually, it's more than just that. It's more to the 2/3 through the second volume. So the pages would be, where did he begin this topic? 1 minute. I think it began on page 1039. Aleph Lamed Tes. I think that's where he began discussing it, the Birurim, and really got into the thick of it a little later, where he starts speaking. Yeah, I should actually say 1045. The Maimer of Chukas, Ayin Hey, 1045 if you want to look it up. That's where we begin. And Shabbos is higher than that. And then he goes into the man, starts a little later. The man begins, I believe. Where does the man begin? Probably more like in the 1060s, 1061, 1062. Okay. So that's what he's referring to now. So there's an oyer that of a likus that's his slapshus, that's birurim. And the man is higher than that, because that's coming from higher than, like he's going to say. Just a moment. I just want to look ahead a second how he's going to qualify this. Okay. So if you read that, it's not really a question, it's a qualification. Then it would appear, if you're just based on that which is a higher energy that you generate? Lechem min hashamayim or lechem min haaretz? Birurim, because you're involved with existence, like we said, the sparks within the food, within everything else in this world. So what do? You're revealing the divine within existence. The man is drawing down an energy from a much higher place that's higher than l'mayla mibirurim. So how is this consistent with what we just learned? That is dafka through the eved in the birurim of this world, for that elevates it from the bottom up, that reaches the highest levels in Keser, Atik, and all the way Atzmos Ein Sof. So the Rebbe Shab now explains. That's why it's not really a question, it's more of a qualification. What does he say? The meaning of what we learned there was that through Birurim, through this work this slow process of refining, separating the kedusha from the klippa, the holiness from the things that are not so. Which is the work in this world of klippas nega, elevating the sparks that are trapped inside the husks and the shells of this world. He says that's what that that's an organized, progressive work, level to level. So that draws an energy that comes into existence in a way that gets enclosed in it. It's not an energy that transcends existence. By contrast, that which is done like higher than Birurim, like the man, or like Shabbos, like he discussed there, and that's the idea that the tzaddik eats not to sustain his body, but l'seva nafshe, to sate his soul. In other words, it's not a Birurim, it's not the work of refining the food and refining the body. It's in order to serve God. So that's a higher level than Birurim, like we learned. So through that, we get the Gilui the way it is, not the way it's slapshus, enclosed in the garments of this world. That's the distinction between the two. So that's in the actual process of what you reveal. What are you revealing? When you do Birurim, you reveal godliness within existence. When you're doing something higher than Birurim, like the man, you're revealing Atzmi the way it is, unfiltered or unshaped, I would say. Commercial would mean not filtered. The way it retains its natural godliness without any garments. But aval be'etzem inyan, that's regarding the level of the divine that you reveal. Aval be'etzem inyan habirurim, but the very concept of birurim. We're not talking about what real level you reveal. The very concept of birurim, that the thing that you are clarifying or separating or refining, it itself, nasa keli lelakus, that does not happen through lamayla birurim, because there you're drawing down an energy into existence. You're not taking the very existence and separating and refining it. When you do it that way, so that the davar mizbara, the thing that's being refined, becomes a keli. Before it was not a container to godliness, a channel for godliness, and now it is. When you do that, through that you're actually reaching and drawing from atzmus dafke. So we have to understand what's going on here. On one hand, you said Lamayla Birurim reaches the Eir Atzmi, and Birurim only the Elokus and the Slapshus. And now you're saying the Etzmi and Birurim that you transform this world reaches Atzmus. So he's going to explain what this means now. I mean, simply put, one is Giluyim and one is Etzem. But we'll see how he explains it. Val Derechshen is Bar Le'il. And similar to what we learned earlier, what was explained earlier. So if you remember when he spoke about, let me just refer you where it was earlier. This was on page. We spoke about the Kalim. 1 second. Yeah, on page 1286. So if you remember, he spoke about there's the Kali that draws down energy, like through Torah mitzvahs, and then there's a higher level that you actually transform the Kali, and that is a far higher level. So now he says like this: Val derech is bar le'il, page 1286. The masha Kali mamshech eir, that what the Kali does when it draws energy into it, al yidei zichur v'tikun Kali. Let's say you exercise your muscles, so it's going to draw more energy from your faculties on a physical level. The same thing spiritually. When a student develops and conditions and exercises his mind, he can draw more intelligence into him. So that is that you're through zichur v'tikun hakeli, through the refinement and the repair or the beautification, or let's say refinement and of the keli. Shenasa b'chinas keli yesher el ha'er. The more the keli becomes more refined in its ability to receive the oir, nimshachei sheberach hakeli. So you'll have more energy that will go into this keli, so that's commensurate to the container. So, for example, if you have a container that's very blocked, if it's blocked, it's not going to have so much energy in it. If you free it, you cleanse it, you remove the impediments, it'll draw more energy. But then there's another level. That's the keli receiving and channeling energy. When the keli itself becomes a force, a divine energy. That is that the helam, where the keli is rooted from, higher than the oyer. The helam becomes revealed, and that's the level of atzmus. So we have atzmus, that's the level of the helam. Then we have the oyer atzmi, that's where the man reaches, and then you have the oyer that comes b'islapshus, that comes through birurim. So the birurim part of drawing the energy is more b'islapshus, more limited than the energy that comes, and the oyer atzmi that comes from man. But the very transformation of the keli touches and reaches a place that's higher than oyer, reaches the helam, and the helam becomes nizgala, which is the level of atzmus. So he says, so too is it with birurim, similar to what we just said with oyer and keli. The birurim shebeseder v'adraga. The birurim is seder adraga, the regular work we do. We eat a meal and we eat it l'shem shamayim, and we're separating instead of taking materialism as an end in itself, or for your own indulgence, or for your own egocentric self-interest. You direct it toward godliness. So that's an aveda b'seder v'adraga. Every day we have to do this work in all our material lives. Kol masach l'shem shamayim, chol d'rachacha de'eyu. He says, "Hu inyan zichur v'tikkun hakeli." That's the process of refining and repairing and cleansing the keli. Commission is bar le'il. I'm going to skip the parentheses now because this is a long parenthesis, if I'm correct, that goes all the way down to the end of the paragraph, I think. 1 second. Let me just make sure. It
only goes down 4 lines.
No. Why 4 lines? Where do you see that? That's a second parenthesis. That's a second parenthesis. That's a short parenthesis. You mean to the words ulamaila, who shenasa kele elyon yesher?
I see. That's the second.
Yeah, that's not. Let me just see where this one ends. Let me just see. I think it's quite long, if I recall correctly. Let me just see. I'm almost sure it goes to the end of the paragraph.
That's correct. I just checked it. It's literally the last the end of the paragraph.
Yeah.
Everything else in between are parentheticals within the parenthetical.
Right.
So does that mean you're going to go to the next paragraph?
No, I'm just looking. I think I'm just looking at the flow here. 1 second. No, I don't want to go to the next paragraph. The next paragraph looks like I'm just wondering where he goes back. Anyway, let me just say how I understand the flow before we go to the parentheses. So he's comparing. So in other words, there are really 3 levels here that we're talking about. And it's critical to understand it because this goes back to a topic we've addressed several times. On one hand, Atzilus is higher than Asiya. So the work you do in this world, where the divine soul comes into a body, into an animal soul, and the very menial, not menial, the very meticulous. What do I want to say? Not menial. I want to say the very not exhausting either. The very hard work of refining this world is, if you think of it in terms of comparing it, let's say, to learning Torah in Gan Eden, or neshamas in higher levels, enjoying godliness, obviously it's avoidance of an eved. It's hard labor. That's why neshama doesn't want to come to this world. It's a difficult work. The Meraglim, the scouts, wanted to stay in the Midbar where they're protected from all these things. Why go work the land and have to struggle with this corrupt world and all the challenges, which is the struggle of Avodas Birurim is a struggle. It's sometimes called a milchama. You're fighting. It's fighting the very selfish materialism of this world and trying to free and open and reveal God in it. So if you think of it in that way, compare that to man, eating the man in the midbar. Of course, the Meraglim wanted to stay in the midbar. That way, they don't have to work the field. They don't have to spend time. They could sit, learn Torah, and serve God, love, awe, reverence. But that's not the kavanah. The kavanah is to come into the world of Birurim. 6 years, sow the fields and the vineyards, etc. And that should be so. In pure Giluyim, of course, the man is higher. It's like Shabbos is higher than the weekdays. However, God didn't want it that way. He wanted 1 day in the week is Shabbos, 6 days is weekdays. It'd have been nice to have 6 days Shabbos and 1 day you go to work, because the kavanah is dira b'tachtein. So if you're talking in the level of Giluyim, obviously the man is a atzmi. It's a pure energy from above. It has no waste. But that's not what the purpose, the kavanah is to come down below. So if you're talking Giluyim, the atzmi is higher than the beis lapshus that comes to Birurim. However, and that's like the that the keli is mamshich. So the more you refine the container, the more there is. So in the world of Birurim, where there's a lot of refinement needed, you have a certain level of energy. Man has higher level of energy because it doesn't really manifest in the kelim that much. It's coming from above. But if you're talking about transforming this world, where the keli itself, and ultimately, like he says, through all the work of Birurim, what are you actually reaching? The real kavanah atzmis, the highest purpose that's higher than higher than man. Like he says, atzmos, higher than atzmi. That's called the helam. That's why the keli, so the very helam of this world, that so-called makes Birurim inferior. The work of the eved, of the servant in the palace, is inferior, ostensibly, to the work of the minister who's sitting and strategizing and studying and advising the king about the loftier matters of running his empire. The cleaning the house, or preparing the meals, or working in the fields is inferior seemingly. But the kavanah is that, the eved. So in Giluyim, the eved is lower. But when he finishes that work, it reaches a level, and that's why it's helam. Why is it helam? Because in Giluyim, it's not as sophisticated and it's not as glamorous and not as lofty as the work of the ministers, as Atzilus, Bri, Yitzirah, and the higher levels. And that's why it's Taka Helam. But the Helam, the negative part of the Helam, is rooted in the positive Helam that's higher than Giluyim altogether. Like we learned, Helam. He doesn't say Helam Atzmi here, but nevertheless, the world of Helam, and that's where the Keli is rooted. So the Keli drawing energy, which we need, that is the process of its growth. It draws energy, but the transformation of this world, that can only happen through the Eved. When you work this world, it cannot happen through man. Lechem min hashamayim doesn't transform this world. It, in a sense, overrides it, if you wish, because it's a gila that comes from above and beyond waste altogether. But a world where we struggled and we separated the waste, the birur, from the oichel, all that work, all that struggle, that ultimately reaches the avodah, like he says. So the keli becoming there, same thing as in Birurim, that the seder v'adraga of the Birurim, meaning the orderly work, is about refining the container until the point that you draw more energy into it. But there's something about the effort of transforming the keli. That would be, I was looking for the end of that line. And he goes straight into parentheses. I thought the second half would be, that's the seder v'adraga. But the etzemin of Birurim, that mizbarer atzmei nasa keli elikus, but this comes atzmus. So you compare it to what we learned before about the keli drawing energy. That would be like if you exercise your muscles or your kelim, you can draw energy of your neshama. But what about the very muscles, the very limbs of the body, the very keli, the very body becomes elikus. That needs to reach a root, which is a helam, higher than Ur altogether. And that's the Atzmi Shebezeh, the Atzmu Shebezeh. Not the Ur Atzmi, but the Atzmu Shebezeh. So that's what I was looking for. Where's the end of the sentence? For all I know, it may even end up in the parentheses. Maybe the parentheses is like a flow of both, but we'll see. I just didn't want to continue until we finish that, like the second half of the sentence, because that's really what he's saying. But the transformation of this world that comes through this work, that reaches a level that is all the way in the etzem. Okay. Any questions before we go to the parentheses? So now let's go to the parentheses. So the Rebbe Rashab says like this. He's going to explain these words that he's using Seder v'hadraga. Because Seder v'hadraga means a progressive level by level by level. So, like we learned, Mutfa, Murgish, Muskel, Ben Chomesh Lemikra, 5 years old, learns Chumash, 10 years old, Mishnah, 15 Gemara, and we grow. That's how we grow. Birurim is in general a Seder v'hadraga aved. Every day you grow, you work that tedious, slow working of refining this world. So he called that Seder v'hadraga, and that Seder v'hadraga, he said the words, so obviously, today you draw down a certain amount of energy, tomorrow you work a little harder, you draw down more energy, and it's a progressive growth, like we spoke about. You climb the steps, the ladder of Seder Ishtalshlus as you become closer and more acclimated to absorbing elikus, godliness, transcendence. You began as a raw piece of matter in this world, and through Aveda, through your work, you slowly refine yourself and the world around you, and it gets more refined, more refined, more refined. So there's that aspect of it, Seder v'hadraga. The other aspect is the very transformation that you're ultimately achieving, and L'asad Lova will be fully revealed in full glory. The Sheresh HaKeli, higher than the Sheresh HaEr, what he just said, Birurim, that reaches all the way to Etzem, the Hela. But now the parentheses, he wants to dissect further. What does this mean, Seder v'hadraga? So Rebbe Rashab says, now it seems to me, both from this parentheses and the earlier one, where he said, Hagam Shua Mavarer, it sounds like that the language in the actual mimer outside of the parentheses is coming from somewhere else. And the Rebbe Rashab, his parentheses are coming to explain that mimer. I haven't found the source yet, but it could be a Mittler Rebbe's mimer, most likely, or Tzemach Tzedek's mimer. That's what it sounds like when I see that kavona, because he says the intention, he's not going to write it about himself. Usually he's quoting another mimer and he's explaining what it says there, just pointing that out. When I find it, I'll let you know. Now, it could, so that I'll do more research. So now he says, V'kavona b'masha omar, the Seder v'hadraga, that we just used that word twice, but right before the parentheses, that the Birurim, in an orderly manner, Seder v'hadraga. Seder means orderly, hadraga means progressive. Seder with dargis, level by level. Not leaping. It's not a leap. It's not a paradigm shift. It's like climbing a ladder, rung by rung by rung. That's what means usually Seder v'hadraga, an orderly fashion, an orderly progressive growth. It says what it says, Seder v'hadraga, who the Beis Inyanim. It's referring to two elements. There's two aspects to this. So he's going to explain two aspects to what means Seder v'hadraga. Ha'alef, that's the first one. He says the first element in Seder v'hadraga is kol zman shelo nizbara legamri li is b'bchinas keli lelakus. As long as that the keli and the tachtenim have not totally become refined to be a pure keli telekus, and that's just a simple example. All of us, sometimes we eat a meal l'shem shamayim, sometimes we do our work for l'kvoidei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to honor God, and sometimes we don't. You can't say your keli, your animal soul, your body, all your activities are a pure seamless keli lelakus. So you can't say nizbara legamri. She says, as long as it's not completely refined to be a keli lelakus, v'urak b'bchinas zichuch levad. It's only that you've refined it, but you haven't completely transformed it. What does that mean? that it's only zichuk levad, she'ein isarvus pselis bei klal, that you don't any no longer you have any waste mixed into it. In other words, you've separated the dross or the waste from the nutrients. I think what he means by that is, you can say two things he means. Either he means that even a very subtle form of waste, you've also eliminated, or I think that's what he means. Meaning klal, that there's no waste at all, even the most subtle form. I think that's what he means. Yeah. First, I thought it meant something else. I thought he meant that you don't have actual waste, but you only have subtle waste. Here it sounds like there's no pselis klal. So in other words, you could say you've eliminated waste. Basically, you are directing your efforts towards godliness, but it's not this bada legamri. You became a complete keli delakus. Now, when a person does that, they elevate to a higher level. That means say the vadroga, that as you refine yourself and you refine your kelim, you are climbing to, and you're eliminating waste, like he says. There's zichuch, but not birur legamri. That means there is cleansing. You have cleansed your life, and you refine yourself. So you go from one level to a higher level. And what does that mean, lamaila? Lamata means that the human being has now become a more refined person, and therefore has reached a higher level of godly experience, godly consciousness and awareness. Lamaila, in the context of keli and eid, who shenasa keli le'eid elyon yeser. As the keli becomes more refined, it's now a keli to a higher energy. I think like a student and a teacher. If the student works on himself, so even though today the teacher can teach him some things, he comes back and he's more refined, more has exerted himself, has worked on himself, his mind is more subtle and sublime, so he can receive a higher energy now. Lamaila, that's how it works. The keli becomes more refined, you reach a higher level of oyer. In Aveda, it means that you elevate to a higher level. This is like the difference between the refinement or the separate clarification. Yani Rishus refers to all neutral matters. We know there's a mitzvah, there's an avera, and there's Rishus. Mitzvah means you must do this. It's a mitzvah, you have to put on tefillin every day. Shabbos, kashrus. There are things are forbidden. Isur, you're not allowed to do. But there's a whole part of our lives which is Rishus. You're allowed to walk in the street. You're allowed to go shopping. You eat. You sleep. It's called the neutral area. That's why it's called Rishus. You're allowed to do it. The question is, how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it l'shem shamayim, directed toward godliness, toward higher awareness? Or are you going to do it for selfish, indulgent purposes? Or neither? It speaks about this in Tanya, chapter 6, 7. She says, so the bitter of Inyani Rishus.
Is that the same as Klippa Noga?
Generally speaking, Rishus is Klippas Nega, yeah. She says, so he's explaining that the difference of the bitter that happens in these so-called permissible matters, va'bitter the mitzvahs, and how about and the refinement that happens through mitzvahs. There's a difference between them, because through mitzvahs, shebezen nasim kelim mamish. When you do a mitzvah, you're actually turning something into a keli telekus. When you take an esrig and the daled minim, and Hashem says use an esrig and daled minim, you're actually taking the esrig as becoming a keli telekus. When you eat a meal Hashem Shemayim, you can say it's directed toward godliness, but you can't say, like he says, Mashen came binyani arashus. You don't say it became a keli telekus. It's become refined, but not a full keli. He's explaining what he's saying, that as long as it's not this bar legamri and it's become a keli, and it's only a zichuch, which means you've eliminated the waste in the context you're eating a meal, not for self-indulgent purposes, but for godly purposes. So you could say that's a refinement, and you now absolutely receive a higher level of oir, but you can't yet say it's become a keli telekus, like a mitzvah. He's using that just to compare these two different. But let's continue. We'll see where he's going with this. Lamed Hey, like he says in Tanya chapter 35, the b'mitzvahs maisius, that through actionable mitzvahs, the actual mitzvahs we do, hine koyach haguf mamish shebasiyah zu, that the very power of the soul, the faculty that is immersed, that is engaged in this action. So when you do a mitzvah maisius, you're going and give tzedakah to someone, or another action mitzvah. You're putting on wrapping tefillin, or anything that's a mitzvah. He says that this koyach nefesh mamish abasiyah zu, this faculty, this strength of your nefesh, this power and faculty in this action, nichlol ba'ir Hashem, gets encompassed and absorbed in the light, in the divine light, v'ritzeinei, and in God's will, u'meyuchad by beyichud gomer, and it becomes joined, it fuses with it, it merges with it in a yichud gomer, which means a complete unification. So you could take your action and you could use it for neutral reasons. You're going to change your tire on your car. I don't know why that came to me. Or you're doing some other thing, which is not, God forbid, in any way against God. One second, yeah. So that's like a neutral thing. However, when you do an asiyah, in a mitzvah, so that could be directed toward godly purposes. You know, you can think, L'shem Shemaim, I'm doing this thing in order to serve God. I'm eating in order to have strength so I can go learn Torah or do a mitzvah. But it's not the mitzvah itself. A mitzvah, he says, the action of the mitzvah, to repeat the words again, is encompassed and absorbed in the divine energy, light, in God's will, and becomes united with it in a total unification. So your action right now, your faculty has become one with God, with godliness. That's called a keli lalakus. V'chein gam koyach nefesh achayunis shebeguf mamish.
Earlier, Rabbi,
Middle of the page. I'm just continuing reading. Middle of the page. I want to look inside chapter 35. I'll do that. I don't have to do it right now. But he continues to speak there. And the same is true with the koyach nefesh hachayunis shebeguf mamish. With the very power of the name for nefesh chayunis, there's a few names. We say nefesh alikis, the divine soul. Nefesh abam is the animal soul. Sometimes we use the word nefesh hativis, the natural soul. And sometimes nefesh hachayunis, which is not fully the animal soul, but it's the biological. The nefesh hachayunis is the nefesh that gives you life. This, you could say, the sustaining soul. So it's not the divine, but the koyach nefesh chayunis shebeguf mamish. That's literally the power that gives us life and sustains our body. So that too, when you're doing a mitzvah, becomes a keli talakus. V'chein ha'asiyah gashmim. So this is all about the faculty. The first thing is the koyach hasiyah, meaning the actual action that you're stretching out your hand and giving somebody charity. Or the power that you use to put on tefillin, you're wrapping. Then there's the koyach chiyunis, which is the chayas of the nefesh that's invested in that. Not just the specific act, but the general power of your nefesh. And then the asiyah itself, the physical act, kamoy atfilin hagashmim. So not just your hand that puts on tefillin, but the tefillin itself, the physical tefillin, nasim kelim lemoichin dezun datzilus. They become actual containers to the mind of Zoh and Malchus of Atzilus. Al derech kelim datzilus. You have now made the tefillin in this world similar to the kelim of Atzilus, that a complete container to the moichin of Zun of Atzilus. So even though it's kelim down below, tefillin is a physical phylacteries, a physical object down below, but they become kelim talakus. So he said three things: the actual act, the very power of your nefesh that allows you to act, and the actual object that you're doing the mitzvah with, all are kelim talakus. That's in a mitzvah. Mashenkin. Oh, this is all from chapter 35. I think I should look. Of course, I don't want to make. I want to make sure I'm getting it right. 1 second. I'm just bringing a Tanya here. I want to look inside exactly what he's saying. I think he's distinguishing between a mitzvah and a shamas, if I recall correctly. But always good to look inside.
I think you said koach hanefesh rather than a koach haguf a few times. Did you intentionally do that? The first line, the Mrs. Meises Hene koach haguf. I think you referred to it as koach nefesh.
He says koach haguf mamash shabas siyazu.
Okay, I think you translated it as koach nefesh. No.
No, that's the next line. Koach nefesh achayunis shebeguf. That's the second line.
I think it's,
Let me just see it inside. Hold on. Let me see. Okay, yeah. He's saying like this. Let me just say what it says in Tanya. He says, he's starting to explain there, the power of actions of mitzvahs that we do in this world. This leads us into Dir B'Tachtenim in chapter 36 and 37. So he's starting to talk here about the actual coming to this world and transforming it. So he says like this, that this is only through actions, the mitzvahs that we do in this world, and not just the neshama alone. Because seemingly you could argue, why do you need mitzvahs? Since the neshama is a chelik elikam emal. So what do mitzvahs add? A neshama comes down to this world. You have a lakus coming into a body. So he says, Hine nishmasa adam afilu tzaddik gamur. The soul of a person, even if he's a complete tzaddik, he serves God with reverence and love out of pleasure, the highest level of Aveda. Afal Pikain, nevertheless, he's not completely nullified or completely subsumed. To be completely absorbed in the Eir Hashem, to be one and completely united in a total unification. He's a separate entity who has reverence for God and loves God. But mitzvahs and good deeds, those good deeds and those mitzvahs, that is God's will. And that will of God is the source of life and sustenance in all existence. I'm just skipping a few lines, and goes through all the concealments in order to manifest, and the world should not cease to be. So it goes through garments, but it's ultimately the essence. That's the world's. They're the inner desire of God. And then there's nothing concealing them at all. So the chayis and the mitzvahs is a direct extension of God's will. So they're not separate at all. They're miyuchid and they're completely encompassed in the Tzeni Yisbarach, and they become mamish one, the yichud gomer, like we just read. And then he goes on to say that this Shechina, the Gilei Alakus, and these mitzvahs comes down when you're doing, it comes down below when you're bottled to it. I just want to see where I'm just reading on. Yeah. It goes on to say, like the mitzvah of learning Torah. I just want to see what other mitzvahs. Here he goes. So then he says like this. So כדי להמשיך ערש גם על גופי ונפשי הבאמיש, שהיא החיונס המלובשת בגופי ממש, צריך לקיים מצוות מייסיס, הנעשים על ידי הגוף ממש, שעוז כוח הגוף ממש שבעשייה זו. So in other words now, when you are now, the soul is inside of a body. So he says the koyach haguf mamish, the very power in the body, in this actual action that you're doing, nichlal ba'er Hashem b'ritzenu miyuchad by b'yichud gamur. He repeats the same language, that it becomes encompassed, absorbed in the divine light, in God's desire, and is one and complete unification. And since it's levush hashlishi shel nefesh al kizru, ozei gam koyach, and then also koyach nefesh hachiyunish shebegufei mamish, shemeklipas nega. Nisapach meral tev and nichla mamish begdusha kenefesh lekis mamish. Because without this action, you couldn't have done the mitzvah. So the very action of now the animal soul and you could say the biological, the living soul, the one that gives him sustains him, has now all become a keli telakus. Here he actually does say that the nefesh chayunis is a mamutza, an interface between the animal soul and the divine soul. That's what he does say. Mutza b'nem and nefesh chayunis. Actually, no. 1 second. I'm correct myself. It's not what he said. I made a mistake. Okay. The thing is interesting, he doesn't mention the actual mitzvahs themselves. I thought that was said here also. Okay. The reason I wanted to read it, because for the next line, let me just go through the next line. So he says like that, okay. B'yichud gamur, v'chein gam koyach nefesh chayun shebegufim, v'chein asiyah gashmi, k'may atfil nagashmi, nasim kelim l'moichin, al derech kelim d'atzilus. Here's the next line, and this is from chapter 35 again, in Tanya. Mashenke nishmas atzadik, yesh v'kelim debiyah. The soul of a tzaddik is yesh, is an entity of its own, like he says, adover nifred b'fnei atzmei, and the kelim of bri yitzir asiyah. Now, of course, the question will be, what do you mean? A tzaddik, we know, is like a merkava. What is he saying? So the Rebbe Rashab adds, well, the fi hanira b'sefer shel beinim sham. Fi hanira means what it appears. According to what it appears in Tanya there, Chapter 35, Hakavana gam al neshamas d'Atzilus. There it appears that he's talking also about neshamas of Atzilus, because he says at Tzadi Gomer there. Shem b'kol mokim b'chinis yesh v'dover b'fnei atzmei. But even a neshama of Atzilus is still, compared to a mitzvah, is still become a separate entity. Like we discussed earlier in Tanya, the chelik elokam mama is like a ben. So even a tzaddik gomer is like a child is separate from his father. Even though he comes from etzem moyach ha'av, but the neshama is elikusha nasi yesh, it is separated to become a separate entity, a person, a neshama that will come down to this world. Whereas the mitzvah never loses its connection. It's always a raisa v'kutshabichu kulachad, like he says earlier in Tanya. And same thing with mitzvahs. It's always Ratzon Hashem, and all it is instruments of God's Ratzon, manifesting in these mitzvahs. That's why you need both. The tzaddik of the neshamas, they really are rooted higher than the mitzvahs and Torah, like we learned here earlier. But it's the mitzvahs that bring it out in a revealed way. So what he's saying here, mitzvahs are direct keli telakus, whereas the neshamas of a tzaddik, even of a tzaddik of Atzilus, is still a separate entity that loves God. Okay, so all this is coming to explain that how mitzvahs are a keli, whereas reshus is not a keli, it's just refining your actions to draw more divine energy into your life. So he's going to say more about this now. Let's read on. I'll read a few more lines. I don't know if I can finish till the end here, but let's see how far I can go. This is all still the first interpretation of Seder V'Adraga. We'll move on, and it's understood the Kamoi Kain HaBirurim B'Inyane HaReshus, that same is true when you talk about the Birurim, the work we do in separating, refining in matters of Reshus, which is not mitzvahs, in the neutral matters, the matters that are we call Reshus, the neutral, or we call them the things that are permissible. They're not greater than the neshama. If the neshama, he says in chapter 35, is somewhat separate relative to the mitzvahs, which are yichud gomur, and he says that explicitly in chapter 35, so the birurim and reshus are not greater than the neshamas. The neshamas, shadizeu masha nichel ba neshamas, because this birurim that you do with the reshus is encompassed inside the neshama. V'imkein lo yadifim ha neshama atzma. So that cannot be something that is higher or greater or superior to the neshama itself. What does he mean? It's nichlal. He means to say that when a person is doing reshus l'shem shamayim, that becomes part of, he's aligning his neutral matters, his regular, it's called regular activities, the routine activities that are not mitzvahs and not the opposite. He's aligning it to what his neshama wants. That's what I think it literally means. So you can't say it's higher than the neshama itself. So therefore, why? Because mitzvahs are a keli gomer. They're a complete keli, like he says, yichud gomer, with godliness. And reshus is not. V'cheinu tachlis abir sheyikol dover b'chinas keli mamsh. And now he concludes the point. So bottom line is, what means Seder V'Adraga? I'll read this line again in a moment. Let me just conclude. He says, so what means orderly? It means because as long as you did not completely refine, what he used the words, kolzman, completely refine, and turn it into a keli talakus, and it's only like a zichuch, which is al derech, then it's still not complete transformation. So that's why you call it Seder V'Adraga, because you're slowly progressing and growing. Like the example being the difference between reshus, which is a so-called progressive work, as we continue to refine ourselves, compared to mitzvahs, which is complete keli talakus. So we see from this a sort of orderly progression in reshus. And then he concludes and says, the last time, v'cheinu tachlis habirur, sheyeh kol dover b'chinas keli mamsh. I think what he means by saying that as we go through this orderly progression, the ultimate birur is that everything should become a keli mamish talakus, but we're not there yet. That's why it's an orderly progression. The asid love it. When we finish the work, then you will see and be revealed even in the avodah of the eved, in the birurim, which ostensibly, like I said, initially is an orderly progression of keli to oir, and then you'll see the transformation of keli to oir. That's the ultimate goal, that we transform the entire existence to keli to oir. Even the reshus looks like is what he wants to say. There's a lot to explain, to unpack here, because you could say, so what does this mean? That when you do a mitzvah, even now, bisman agolos, it's a keli talakus. But we learned earlier, a mitzvah doesn't transform the keli talakus. It just makes this world a keli talakus. The transformation of keli, the keli itself should be a talakus, not just a keli to oir. We learned you need b'chol moedecha, ava b'chol moedecha, and all the mesiras nefesh and simcha shel mitzvah. So I'm not positive how he's using that here with mitzvah and reshus, but the general idea is to explain Seder V'Adraga. And I would wait till we really finish the whole subject to be able to fully unpack and explain it. Now he goes to Ayin Beis. Remember, he said in the beginning of the parentheses that there's two things, two elements in what it says Seder V'Adraga. I don't want to leave it hanging because this will be the last class till next Wednesday. So maybe I'll just read it quickly. What do you guys think? Should I stop here or should I read till the end? of the paragraph.
Read to the end.
How did I know you're going to say that?
We will have 5 days to listen to what you said over and over again to let it sink in, and then you can come back and do a chizur.
Yeah. I mean, this. I'm saying even this first element, we need explanation. I don't have it all spelled out here. I need to review it myself, but I think the general gist I got, that's about Seder V'Hadraga. Okay, the Ayin Beis in saying Seder V'Hadraga is like this. V'hu ha'ikar, and that's the primary meaning of order, the orderly progressive. Whenever it says two things, and v'hu ha'ikar means the second thing is this is the primary explanation. What is it? The b'chinas avdi, the level of avdi, my servant, who abirur the shem man atzme, the shem ban atzme. That is the refinement of the shem ban, as we learned earlier. That the ban itself means how it's all manifest in the animal soul. In the chemer, it itself is being refined. Pinchas ben Elazar. So there's a mimer, Habeis. The second mimer, Pinchas ben Elazar, Habeis, which is in volume 2, page, he says 1065 and on. What does he say there? The shem ban poyel habitl be'etzem husa yesh yesem shema. That shem ban causes a more fundamental or core level of bittul of the very yesh more than shema. So even though he said earlier in Rashi Amatis, he says that bittul akelim be'etzem husa from atzma shema. But there's something about Shem Ban, because it goes into the very core of the Ban. It's not coming from Ma, that causes a deeper bittul. A bittul betzem musa yesh yeser from Shem Ma. Okay. So based on that, the Seder V'Hadraga shayach ba'abir the Ora Shem Ma mevarer. V'hu inyan zichuch lebelvad. So the Seder V'Hadraga we're talking about, this progressive, orderly work, that applies in the birur of the reflection of Shem Ma, which is Mevarer, the one that does the refining. But that's only a refinement. In other words, you're not transforming the yesh, which Shem Ban does. You're only refining the yesh. To put it in simple English, it means this. Let's say you're working with a mentor, with a great teacher, and he's training you. He's educating you. So yes, you're becoming more refined. You're becoming more sublimated. But it's not really changed you fundamentally until you do the work. As much as he can do for you, there's something that's lacking until you yourself do it, because then you own it. So Shem Ma definitely refines, like he's saying here, but it's still like an outside force that's refining the yesh. Because Shem Ma is not a yesh. Shem Ma is bittul. That's why zichuch levad. U'kamoy ba'aveda shal pitam v'das. In the parentheses he adds. Like the work we do, that is the rational. Al pitam v'das means a veda that's not l'mayla mitam. It's not super rational. It's Aveda Pitam V'das. You're working in a logical, progressive way, an orderly way that makes sense. By doing that, like for example, every day you work on your animal soul a little. Today I'm going to work on my emotion of my animals, things it's drawn to. It's chesed, it's gvura. Different ways that we work on our animalistic inclinations, our selfish inclinations. So he says that's a bit of a zichuch. You're refining and you're refining and purifying the animal soul. It's in a very orderly way. Avla bitl the shem ban atzmei, hu be'etzem hayesh. But the bitl that comes from shem ban atzmei, which what he said before, the avdi, that work from within, from the bottom up, that affects the etzem hayesh. The Eina Be'inyan said the Seder Ba'adraga. And that's not an orally thing, because what that means most likely means, because it's not coming like you're growing every day, becoming more refined. There's something like almost like an epiphany, a revelation, something that just a paradigm shift that your very yesh recognizes something greater. So it's not just you're being trained. Like you could say you have a few years of training and then you begin to own it. Then it's not just an orderly progression like in education. We teach you something. You come to a point where your very being realizes, has a new type of revelation. And that's coming from within, from the bottom up. That's not Beseder Ba'adraga. Ubegmar habirur, and when that birur is finished, hu shayesh nepach letev b'yeser. You want to know something? I would argue that the parenthesis ends right after the words the Seder Ba'adraga, and it's missing the second parenthesis, because the Gemara Birurim sounds to me like the end of the phrase that began before the parentheses. Because before the parentheses, you're speaking about Zichuch v'Tikun, which is more orderly, and he didn't finish the end of it. This sounds to me like the end of the parentheses, and now he says Gemara Birurim. When we finish this, we're fine. Gemara Birurim hu shayesh nepach letev b'yeser. That the yesh is transformed to something, because if you read it, well, that's not necessarily found, it follows the parentheses, but it also follows that which was before the parentheses. Like Eliyahu, that his very body became an angel. His body went up to heaven, wasn't buried, because his body was transformed and became angelic. Not just like a keli to an oir, but now it's become transformed. Like the body of Moshe when he went up on the mountain, he didn't eat food. So it says his very body was sustained by ruchnius. That's not just that the body is receiving energy from the soul. It means the very body is directly linked intravenously to the spirit, to ruchnius. And it was a keli to Dvar Hashem. The ima yesh b'zeh yisur and godel ma'ed. The parenthesis is actually explaining keli. Even though there's a great quality in this, he's still a keli to Dvar Hashem. And l'chein ha'yegufei tzorich kfura. That's why Moshe his body needed to be buried. Eliyahu Hanavi, his very body became a spiritual. Moshe became a keli telekus, but he did not become transformed telekus. So his body needed to be buried. Behind the Begmara Birurim, yes, Yisrin Godel Ba'abir D'Shema. And that means that the conclusion of the Birurim, there's a great quality in the Birur of Shem Ban, Masha yesh atzmai nepach letev, that the yesh itself not just got refined, didn't just become a keli, but it actually transformed to good. For hu inyan shakeli nasa'ir, and as the keli itself has become energy. The zeiz dafki ha'ela b'chinas atzmus ein sof. I may be making a mistake because he does have a parenthesis at the end. I know I tried to move the parentheses earlier. So I'm not sure. So I may be wrong. I want to look, maybe now we have the manuscripts. I could look it up. We'll see. Anyway, we'll continue. Let's finish the line. And this goes to Atzmus Ein Sof more than Etzem Ha'er, U'kamoishi is Boer. As shall be Kamoishi is Boer, Eid Be'ez Ezra Hashem is Baruch. As shall be explained furthermore with God's help. In the idea that the Keser Shem Tov, the crown of the good name, that rises above the other three crowns, the Keser Teda, Keser Kuhuna, and Keser Malchus. This is the Keser that comes from the very Keli becoming Eid. In the footnote, they say that this, what the Rebbe Rashab writes, that it will be explained, he never actually wrote it. We didn't find it. In other words, it's part of what he didn't conclude in the conclusion of this Hemshech. Okay, so I went a little over here to finish the paragraph. Just to sum up, even though I said I'd like to move the parentheses earlier, but I want to be careful because the Rebbe Rashab does have a parentheses here at the end. And maybe when we learn further, it makes sense. I just thought that it seems like when he says the words ubigmara birur, but on the other hand, he is talking about the birur of Shema. So Seder v'Hadraga refers to the refinement of existence, but not its transformation. Transformation will happen l'osed love in the future when it's all finished. But as long as it's not completely refined, it's a Seder v'Hadraga. And he explained two ways to say it. One is the idea that that it's an orderly work, the orderly work, like al derech divrei reshus compared to mitzvahs. And the iker, the primary thing is because dafka shem ban itself, that transformation is not an orderly one. That's a paradigm shift. Whereas when shem ma is refining, that's the orderly process. Those are the two things that he said about Seder v'Hadraga. Now, we'll definitely go over this more than once and get it clear. But I will stop here. Tell me if anybody has any questions. If not, we'll stop here at the end of this paragraph, and we will review it again, as I said. Then it goes back to the Birurim and Higher.
It seems like here we're talking about the differences between Bittul Yeshua and Bittul Metzius.
You're speaking too low. I can't hear you.
It seems like here we're talking about the two levels of Bittul Hayesh and Bittul Metzius.
Where do you see the word Birurim and Higher?
We don't. That's why. But I'm saying that the discussion.
No, he's quoting the Tanya, Perek Lamed Hey, where he calls the Tzaddik Gomer. He says is a yesh the language that he uses is he's not talking about the Bitul Metzius here.
Because he's talking about transforming the Kli.
He's comparing an neshama to mitzvahs. The actual language is mitzvahs. Hudavar b'fnei atzmei yireh Hashem v'ayavay. Even a tzaddik gomer b'ayvad Hashem. Yeah. You're asking whether the full transformation is Bitul Metzius?
Yes.
He doesn't use those words here. He uses the word that the keli, the yesh, becomes elikus. More than just a keli to the yesh atzmei nepach l'teiv. I don't know if this is Bitul Metzius. I don't know.
But it is interesting that it seems that the Rebbe says clearly that it's two.
You have to speak up. It's very low. I can't hear.
It seems very interesting that the Rebbe says two different types of avoda. It seems like one is Hadraga, Seder Hadraga, and then there's a completely different one, which is, as your term used was as an epiphany or a paradigm shift, which is
that's the distinction between being a keli telekus and zichuch, which is Seder Hadraga, the Birurim. And the other element that the etzem, that the thing itself becomes a keli telekus, is that transformation is beyond Seder v'Hadraga. That reaches all the way up to the helen of the atzmus. Yeah, that's.
And the latter is when you're doing mitzvahs, and the former is when you're just using.
No. He didn't say that.
So which is which? What behavior yields which level of perfection, if you will?
I would think, if I could just add, maybe. I mean,
well, there's the regular avodah we all do day to day. That's an orderly avodah. We get more and more refined, and then there's a transformation where the very, very existence, this yesh of this world, the yesh of the person, becomes a lakus. What we're talking about earlier about.
I would think Yitzhak, maybe
At
it's
the end of the work, after thousands of years of work, that's what we will
Got
achieve,
it.
that level.
I got it.
In
I
the
would think
discussion of Seder V'Adraga, he compared mitzvahs to Rishus to just explain how Rishus is not fully a keli, it's levels. But as I said, even mitzvahs is a keli telekus. We learned earlier, to transform, you need more than just being a keli. That's what I pointed out. Yeah.
I would think maybe Yitzhak, these two different types of avoda. One might be the avoda of Torah mitzvahs, which was zichuch, of refining, and then the second one, the epiphany change and the paradigm shift, could be a level of tshuva. Tshuva is a leap. It's a transformative leap that doesn't go.
We learned earlier, tshuva is the force that does transform, but he also said Ava b'chol ma'idecha, that comes min ha'meitzar, also transforms. If you go back, we learned that before on page, where was that? Min ha'meitzar.
So maybe it's a matter of kavana and how much of yourself you're putting into it. Are you just doing it like a robot, or are you giving it with chomei odecha, avaraba, and simcha shel mitzvah, and really getting into it?
I think there's another step. I think it's even, maybe I'm wrong though, Rabbi Jacobson, does the Rebbe say there what we learned earlier, that the vote of tshuva is even higher than b'chol modecha and simcha shel mitzvah?
We learned it earlier on page 1298 and 1299. He spoke about it, that tshuva transforms, and ava b'chol meidecha ultimately is a lower level. But then on page 1299, he said when ava b'chol meidecha comes min ha'meitzar, from a distressed state, then it also has the same quality like tshuva. And as I explained, soon, starting on page 1306, he's going to start explaining the difference between tzaddikim and Baal Tshuva in this context. So there's more to come, a lot more to come about this. So let me sign off here. So we finished the paragraph, at least the first draft of at the end of, close to the end of page 13.